The courtroom was cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you walk into an air-conditioned building on a Georgia summer morning. This was the kind of cold that lives inside old buildings, the kind that soaks into the wood of the benches, settles into the stone floors, and wraps itself around your shoulders like a warning. I sat at the plaintiff's table and listened to the sound of footsteps. Click, click, click. Slow, deliberate. Each step placed with the precision of a man who had rehearsed this walk 100 times in his bathroom mirror. Trevor Okafor, 6'2", charcoal gray suit, French cuffs, crossed the length of Fulton County Superior Court like he owned the floor beneath him. He set his leather portfolio on the defense table, smoothed the front of his jacket with both hands, and did not look at me. He never looked at me when he could avoid it. I understood why. Looking at me made the story harder to sell. From where I sat, I could see the gallery behind the partition. Every seat was filled. I recognized faces the way you recognize faces in your own neighborhood, not because you know their middle names or their children's birthdays, but because you have stood next to them in line at the grocery store, passed them in the parking lot of Greater Shiloh Baptist, watched their cars pull in and out of driveways on the same street for 20-30 years. They were not here out of curiosity. People who come out of curiosity wear a certain expression, loose, entertained, waiting for something to happen. The people in that gallery wore something different. They were tight around the eyes, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. They were here because they were afraid of what it meant if I lost. At the table directly across from mine, my son Deshaun Douglas sat with his back straight and his hands folded in front of him on the table. 38 years old, dark suit, new watch. I didn't recognize it, which meant it had been purchased in the last 6 months, which meant it had been purchased with money that belonged to me. Beside him, his wife Renee had her legs crossed and her chin tilted just slightly upward, the way a person holds their head when they want to look above reproach rather than merely innocent. Her lips were painted the color of a dark red rose. She did not look at me either. Between us stretched 12 feet of polished oak table and 5 years of betrayal so carefully constructed that I had not seen it coming until the letter arrived in my mailbox on a cold January morning and I stood in my kitchen in my robe and understood, for the first time in my life, that the most dangerous kind of enemy is the one you raised. My name is Billy Douglas. I am 63 years old. I am a black woman from Atlanta, Georgia, and I have been building things my entire life. Businesses, homes, families, futures. I know what it costs to build something. I know what it feels like when someone tries to take it. I sat in that courtroom with my hands flat on the table and my back straight as a door frame, and I was not afraid. I want to be honest about that, because people always expect the dramatic version. The trembling woman, the tearful eyes, the voice that breaks at just the right moment. That is not who I am, and it was not who I was that morning. I was not afraid because I had something they did not expect. I had been waiting for this day for 11 months, and I had not spent those 11 months crying. There is one thing I want you to know about me before anything else, and it has nothing to do with the lawsuit or the courtroom or my son's betrayal. In the back of my kitchen, on the bottom shelf of the cabinet next to the stove, there is a cast iron pot. 12 quarts, black as midnight, heavy as a stone, with a crack along the handle that was repaired with a piece of wire sometime in the 1960s. My mother, Ida Mae Williams, carried that pot from Yazoo City, Mississippi to Atlanta, Georgia in the summer of 1971. She wrapped it in a kitchen towel and placed it in a cardboard box between her good shoes and her Bible. And when she arrived in Atlanta with $47 and 2 children under the age of 6, that pot was the first thing she unpacked. She said you could build a life around a good pot if you knew how to cook. I believed her. I still do. I grew up watching Ida Mae stand at a stove that was too short for her. She was nearly 6 feet tall. Her back curved like a question mark over burners she could manage in her sleep. She cooked for other people's families during the week, white families in Buckhead who paid her $6 an hour and called her the help, and meant it as a description, not a title. On weekends, she cooked for hours. The difference was not in the recipes. The difference was in the way she held herself. During the week, her shoulders were pulled in, making herself small. On weekends, they were rolled back and her chin was up, and the kitchen smelled like she was feeding royalty because, she said, that was exactly what she was doing. I was my mother's daughter in every way that mattered. In 1989, I was 30 years old, newly married to James Douglas, and working as a line cook at a hotel banquet kitchen on Peachtree Street. James drove a delivery truck for a furniture company. We had a one-bedroom apartment in Vine City, a second-hand dining table, and $1,400 in a savings account that we had been building for 2 years, putting in $50 every month without fail. We also had Ida May's pot, which she had given me as a wedding gift. She handed it to me in both hands, the way you hand someone something sacred, and she said, "Don't let anybody tell you what this is worth. Only you know what this is worth." With that $1,400 and a second-hand refrigerator purchased on installment, James and I opened Douglas Catering and Events out of our apartment kitchen. We started with church suppers and birthday parties in the sweet Auburn neighborhood, the part of Atlanta that was ours, had always been ours. The stretch of Auburn Avenue where Dr. King was born, and where black business had put down roots so deep the city had never been able to pull them out entirely. Word traveled the way it always does in a community that takes care of its own. Through mouths, through phone calls, through somebody's cousin telling somebody else's neighbor. Within 2 years, we had outgrown the apartment kitchen. Within 5, we had a commercial space. By 2005, Douglas Catering and Events had 15 employees, a full-service kitchen, and a client list that included corporate events, weddings, funerals, graduations, and the annual dinner for 3 of the most prominent churches in Atlanta. By 2010, the company was worth $1.2 million. I want you to understand that number not because I'm proud of the money, though I worked for every dollar of it, but because I want you to understand what we built from $1,400 and a cast iron pot that a woman carried from Mississippi because she believed you could build a life if you knew how to cook. There was one thing that set our operation apart from every other catering company in Atlanta, and I protected it the way Ida May had protected her recipes. Every Saturday morning, without exception, I stood at the stove myself. I did not let the kitchen staff make the cornbread. My sous chef, a wonderful man named Gerald who had worked with us for 12 years, used to tease me about it. He'd say, "Billy, you trust me with a 50-person wedding and you won't trust me with a pan of cornbread?" I'd say, "Gerald, I trust you with everything I have, but the cornbread is a signature, and a signature you don't let anybody else write." He always laughed. He understood. James Douglas was not a flashy man. He was not the kind of husband who brought flowers for no reason or remembered the name of every movie you had ever watched together. He was the kind of husband who got up at 5 in the morning to scrape ice off your car before you woke up. He was the kind of man who noticed when the kitchen faucet was dripping and fixed it without being asked. He kept his word with such consistency that you stopped being surprised by it and started taking it as a fact of nature, the way you take sunrise as a fact of nature. We had one child, Deshaun, born in 1986, 3 years before we started the business. I will not pretend that Deshaun was an easy child, because he was not. He was bright and restless and charismatic in the way that beautiful children sometimes are. The kind of child who smiled his way through consequences that other children had to sit in. Teachers loved him. Coaches loved him. The women at Greater Shiloh Baptist loved him. He had James's bone structure and my mother's eyes and a laugh that filled whatever room he was in. What he did not have, and what I did not see clearly enough for too long, was patience. Deshaun wanted things quickly, not out of laziness. He would work when the goal was visible and the reward was close. But the long game, the quiet accumulation of small decisions made correctly over 20 years, that was not his nature. That was my nature. That was James's nature. Deshaun inherited our capacity for charm, but not our capacity for endurance. I told myself that was fine. I told myself he would grow into it. He married Renee Calloway in 2019, 4 months before James died. I was glad. Renee was sharp and polished and had an MBA from Georgia State, and I genuinely thought, that she would help him settle, give him structure, give him direction. I called her my second daughter. I wrote her name into my personal address book on the page next to James's mother's name, which is the page I keep for people who are permanent. I was wrong, but I did not know that yet. James died on November 3rd, 2019, of a hemorrhagic stroke. He had been sick for 8 months. I cared for him at home. I did not hire a night nurse. I did not put him in a facility. I got up at 3 a.m. when he needed me, and I sat with him through every day that was hard and every day that was harder. When he died in our bed with my hand in his and the bedroom window open the way he liked it. Deshaun flew in from New York, where he and Renee had been living for the previous year. He sat beside me the night after James was buried in the living room, in the dark, and he held my hand. He said, "Mom, I'm here. You're not alone." I believed him. That is the part that still costs me something when I let myself think about it too long. Not the money, not the land, the hand in mine in the dark, and the lie that lived inside it. In March of 2021, I asked Deshawn to come work with me at Douglas Catering full-time. James had always been my operational partner. The logistics, the scheduling, the vendor relationships. Without him, I was managing everything myself, and I was 61 years old, and I was tired in a way that I had not been tired before. The kind of tired that doesn't go away with sleep. Deshawn said yes. He and Renee moved back to Atlanta. I bought him a car, a Mercedes E-Class, dark blue, the color he'd wanted since he was 16. I paid the first and last month's security deposit on the townhouse they rented in Buckhead. When Renee mentioned she was looking into refreshing her certifications, I wired $4,500 to cover the course fees without being asked. I want to be clear about this. I am not telling you these things to make myself sound like a martyr. I am telling you these things because you need to understand the context in which the betrayal happened. It did not happen to a stranger. It happened inside a relationship where I had given freely and expected nothing back except what any parent expects: basic decency. The first question I remember Renee asking me about the company's structure was in March of 2021. We were in my kitchen, she was helping me prep for an event, and she asked, casually, almost idly, as if she were making conversation, whether the company's real estate was held under the business entity or personally. I told her the truth. The commercial building on Auburn Avenue was owned by the Douglas Family Trust, the same trust that my mother's land was registered under. My name was the sole beneficiary. The land itself, the lot on Auburn Avenue that Ida May had purchased in 1973, the same lot the building sat on, was registered in my name personally. Renee nodded. She wrote something in the small notebook she always carried. I thought nothing of it. She was an MBA. She thought in terms of structures and categories. I figured she was just organizing information in her head. I have replayed that conversation many times since. I should have asked what she was writing. 14 months later, on November 14th, 2022, Deshawn arrived at my house at 7 in the evening with a stack of documents in a manila folder. He set them on my kitchen table while I was finishing the dinner dishes. He said it was a tax restructuring package. He said our accountant, a man named Gerald Finch, not Gerald my sous chef, a different Gerald, a man I had met exactly twice, had recommended moving the business assets into a new LLC structure to reduce our annual liability exposure. He said it was standard. He said it was protective. "You trust me, right, Mom?" he said. The question should have stopped me. Instead, I dried my hands on the dish towel, sat down at the kitchen table, and I looked at the documents. I looked at the headers, which said what Deshawn said they said. I read the first paragraph of the first page, which used language I recognized from previous business filings, terms about asset protection and liability structure and operating agreements. My reading glasses were in the bedroom. My eyes had been bothering me for weeks. Deshawn was waiting, smiling the smile that had been getting him through situations since he was 4 years old. I signed. 6 pages. My signature, 6 times. It took 4 minutes. I handed the folder back to him and he said, "Thank you, Mom. This is going to save us a lot of money." And he kissed me on the cheek, and he left. That was a Tuesday. On Friday, January 3rd, 2023, I received a letter from Atlanta Business Banking informing me that the operating account for Douglas Catering and Events had been closed, and the remaining balance of $47,339 had been transferred to a new account under new authorized management. I called Deshawn. It went to voicemail. I called the office. The woman who answered was a voice I didn't recognize, a new receptionist, hired while I was out sick with a respiratory infection in December. She told me she was not authorized to put through calls regarding account management issues, and that she would pass along a message. No one called back. On January 9th, a certified letter arrived. I signed for it at my front door in my robe, holding the pen with the same hand that had signed the kitchen table documents 7 weeks earlier. I opened the envelope at the kitchen counter. The letter informed me that pursuant to the asset transfer documents executed on November 14th, 2022, the operating entity, Douglas Catering and Events, LLC, and all associated assets, including the commercial building and the land parcel at 447 Auburn Avenue, Atlanta, Georgia, had been transferred to the ownership of Deshawn Marcus Douglas and Renee Douglas. The transfer had been signed by me. The land had been in my mother's name, and then my name for 50 years. Ida May had bought it with the wages she had earned cleaning houses, in a city that would not give her a mortgage, during a decade when Black Americans in the South were building ownership out of cash, and will because the financial system had been constructed to exclude them. I stood in my kitchen in my robe, and I held the letter in both hands, and I looked at the cast-iron pot on the shelf behind the stove, and I understood two things at once. The first, my son had stolen from me. The second, he had counted on me being the kind of woman who would be too heartbroken to fight back. He had made an error in his calculations. I called Deshaun from my kitchen. He picked up this time. He said, "Mom, you agreed to this. You signed everything." I said, "I signed a tax restructuring document, not a deed transfer." He said very slowly and very carefully, the way someone says something they have rehearsed, "Mom, are you sure about what you remember? You've been having a hard time lately. You've been tired. Maybe you should talk to someone before you do anything you regret." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. The second call, 2 days later, Renee answered his phone. She said, "Mrs. Douglas, I think before we have any further discussion, you should probably speak with a doctor, just to make sure you're feeling like yourself. Deshaun is very worried about you." I said, "Renee, I am feeling exactly like myself. And myself has more than 30 years of business experience, a very clear memory, and a pen she should not have picked up without her glasses on." Renee said, "I'll have Deshaun call you back." He did not call back. On January 23rd, I received another certified letter. This one was a court filing. Deshaun Douglas had petitioned the Superior Court of Fulton County for legal guardianship over my person and my affairs on the grounds of documented cognitive decline, constituting diminished capacity to manage my own financial and personal decisions. Attached to the petition was a 3-page medical evaluation signed by a Dr. Raymond Holt, MD, identifying himself as a specialist in geriatric cognitive health. The evaluation concluded that I showed measurable signs of early-stage dementia, including short-term memory impairment, difficulty with complex document comprehension, and susceptibility to confusion under pressure. I sat with that evaluation for a long time. I read every paragraph. I read it the way I should have read those 6 pages on November 14th. Slowly, completely, glasses on, no one waiting. I had never met Dr. Raymond Holt in my life. I went to my kitchen. I put water on for coffee. I stood at the counter and I looked at myself in the small mirror on the wall above the dish rack. The mirror James had hung there because he said I should be able to see myself while I cooked. That a woman who cooks should know what she looks like when she's doing something right. I said to the woman in that mirror, "They want you to be crazy, so you need to be sharper than you have ever been in your life." The next morning, I called Leroy Patterson, who had been James's closest friend for 40 years and who knew every business contact in Atlanta worth knowing. I asked him who the best property rights attorney in the city was for a situation where someone had forged your intent, if not your signature. He didn't hesitate. He said, "Claudette Watkins. Tell her Leroy sent you. She'll see you today." I put on my good shoes, my navy blazer, and I drove to a building on Peachtree Street. I was not going to ask Claudette Watkins to save me. I was going to ask her to hand me the tools I needed to save myself. The offices of Watkins & Associates occupied the 12th floor of a building on Peachtree Street that had no personality from the outside. Gray glass, revolving doors, a lobby with a security desk, and a directory board that listed 47 different businesses. The elevator smelled like someone's lunch. But when the doors opened on 12, the air changed. Dark wood paneling. A receptionist who looked up without smiling and said, "Mrs. Douglas, Ms. Watkins is expecting you," before I had given my name. Framed documents on the walls. Not diplomas, not motivational quotes. Court orders. Settlement agreements. Deeds of property returned to their rightful owners. Hung like trophies because that is exactly what they were. Claudette Watkins was 55 years old, built like a woman who had been standing her ground her entire life, and wearing a pair of reading glasses pushed up on top of her head like a crown she'd forgotten to take off. She came around her desk to shake my hand, not the halfway gesture of someone being polite, but a full grip, direct eye contact, 2 seconds held. She said, "Sit down and tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because you think it doesn't matter. In my experience, the things people think don't matter are exactly the things that decide cases." I told her everything. From the November signing, to the January letters, to the guardianship petition, to Dr. Raymond Holt's evaluation I had never consented to. I spoke for 40 minutes without interruption. Claudette took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the desk. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me over her glasses. "Billy," she said, "they did this carefully. The signature is yours. The notarization is legitimate. The doctor has credentials. The other side has money, and they have a narrative. Confused elderly woman, loving son stepping in to manage what she can no longer handle. It's a story that juries have believed before." She paused. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, not the way you'd answer your pastor, the way you'd answer a doctor. Is there anything, any moment in the last 2 years, where your memory genuinely failed you? Where you forgot something significant, got confused, said something that didn't track?" I looked at her steadily. "I forgot where I put my keys in October. I'm 62 years old and I was grieving. That is the extent of my confusion." Claudette held my gaze for a moment. Then she picked her pen back up. "Good. Now tell me what you have." I reached into my bag and placed a small notebook on her desk. Brown leather cover, the kind you buy at a drugstore for $3. I had filled it from front to back. Every phone call logged with time and date, every interaction documented, every discrepancy I had noticed in the months between November and now, every time a number didn't match, every time a name appeared on a document that I didn't recognize, every time someone at the office had looked at me with the particular expression of someone who had been told something about me that wasn't true. Claudette turned pages slowly. She read without speaking for a long time. Then she looked up. "When did you start keeping this?" "The night I signed. I felt something wrong the moment he drove away. I couldn't name it. But I wrote down everything I could remember and I started writing everything that happened after." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Billy, this notebook is going to matter. 1 week before trial, Trevor Okafor's office sent a settlement offer through a courier. A sealed envelope, hand-delivered to my home at 10 in the morning. Claudette called me 20 minutes later. She had received the same offer electronically. $180,000. Full withdrawal of the guardianship petition. Mutual non-disclosure agreement preventing either party from discussing the matter publicly. Release of all further claims." Claudette read it to me over the phone. She read it twice. Then she said, "It's your decision. I'll support whatever you choose." I was standing in my kitchen when she read it. I looked at the commercial building where Douglas Catering had operated for 16 years. I could not see it from my window, but I knew exactly what it looked like. Brick facade, green awning, the painted lettering above the door that James and I had stood outside of on the day we signed the lease, holding hands like children. I knew what Ida May's land was worth. I had checked the Fulton County property records the week after I received the January letter. The land alone was assessed at $830,000. The building at $610,000. The business goodwill and client contracts, by Claudette's estimate, at no less than $400,000. $180,000. They were offering me $180,000 to be quiet about the theft of $1.84 million and to let my son hold legal guardianship over a woman whose mind was perfectly intact. They were offering me money to agree that I was confused. I said to Claudette, "Write back one word. No, capital N, capital O." She laughed, short and dry. "I'll make it 2 words. No, thank you. The community of Sweet Auburn is not large. It has never needed to be large to be powerful." By the 2nd week of February, the news had traveled the way news travels in close neighborhoods, not through newspapers, but through the informal network of church bulletins and front porch conversations, and the particular silence that falls when someone walks into a room and everyone already knows. People began canceling events booked with Douglas Catering under Deshawn's management. Not loudly, not with confrontation. They simply called and said they had decided to go in a different direction. 3 corporate clients, 2 church events, a wedding that had been booked 8 months prior. Renee hired a public relations contact to manage what she called the narrative. Articles appeared in 2 local outlets framing Deshawn as a devoted son managing a difficult family situation, protecting his mother from the stress of running a company that had grown beyond what she could comfortably handle. The language was careful, sympathetic, designed to preempt. I did not read the articles. Claudette read them for me and gave me summaries. I spent those days doing what I had always done. I cooked. I prepared for the Saturday morning cornbread delivery to Greater Shiloh that I had started doing on my own since losing access to the commercial kitchen. I went over documents with Claudette every evening from 6 to 8. I slept 6 hours a night. I was not performing calm. I was genuinely in the place that grief and time and certain kinds of hard experience put you. A place past panic, where what remains is a particular cold clarity that I have no better word for than readiness. Then came the night of March 3rd, 11 days before trial. I was in bed, nearly asleep, when my phone lit up on the nightstand. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. No name in the preview. Just a notification that there was an image attached. I picked up the phone. I opened the message. It was a screenshot. The kind you take on a phone when you press 2 buttons quickly and the screen flashes. The screenshot showed a text conversation. The names at the top of the exchange were Deshawn and Renee. The date visible on the messages was August 14th, 2019. James was still alive in August of 2019. He had been diagnosed with the condition that would kill him in March of that year and was in decline, but he was alive. He was in our house. He was in our bed on the nights he couldn't manage the couch. I read the messages in the screenshot slowly. Renee. She won't sign voluntarily. You know that. She built that business herself and she doesn't trust anyone with it, not even you. Deshawn. So what do we do? Renee. We wait. After your father is gone, she'll be in grief. She'll be exhausted. She'll want to lean on you. That's the window. But we have to be patient. Deshawn. How long? Renee. As long as it takes. This isn't something you rush. I sat up in bed and I held the phone with both hands and I did not breathe for what felt like a long time. They had planned this before James died. It was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a desperate decision made by a son who had gotten himself into financial trouble and panicked. It was a plan, a patient, calculated years-long plan designed around the most vulnerable moment of my life, the window of grief after I lost my husband, executed exactly as Renee had described it. I set the phone down on the nightstand. I put my feet on the floor. I sat in the dark for a while. Then I picked the phone back up and I called Dorothy Freeman. Dot and I had been friends for 35 years. She was the kind of friend who picked up the phone at any hour and didn't ask why you were calling first. She just said, "I'm here," and waited for you to find the words. She picked up on the second ring. "Billy, it's past midnight." "I know. Dot, I found something." "What kind of something?" "The kind that tells you the whole story from the beginning." I read her the messages. She was quiet through all of it. When I finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then, "Billy, are you all right?" "I'm all right," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me a little. I'm not all right the way I was before any of this happened, but I'm all right for tomorrow and the day after and the day I stand up in that courtroom, because now I know exactly what I'm fighting, and I've never been afraid of something I could see clearly. James would be... She stopped. "I know," I said. "I know, Dot." We stayed on the phone until 2:30 in the morning, mostly in silence, the way old friends do when words aren't the point. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. I washed my face, made coffee, and stood in the kitchen in the quiet that exists in a house before the day fully arrives. The light over the stove was on. I always leave it on, and it cast a warm circle across the counter and across Ida May's pot on the shelf, the same warm pot black as it had been for 60 years. I got dressed with intention. Black dress. Not for mourning. My mother wore black when something mattered, when she needed to be taken seriously, when she wanted her presence to announce itself before she said a word. The dress I wore that morning was the one I had bought for James's funeral. Fitted, conservative, a single strand of pearls at the collar that had belonged to Ida May. Low brown leather heels, the ones I had purchased in 1998 from a shoe store on Auburn Avenue that no longer existed, polished the night before until they held the light. I sat at the kitchen table and painted my nails. Lavender purple, the color I had worn every Monday since 1987. Not a statement. A continuation. I was not a different a woman today than I had been yesterday, or the year before, or the decade before that. I was exactly who I had always been. I just needed to stand up in a room and prove it. Claudette arrived at 7:15 in a black sedan. She looked at me from the front door to my shoes and back up to my face, and she nodded once. "Good," she said. That was all. We arrived at the courthouse at 8:10. The parking lot was already half full. The gallery crowd, I realized. People who had come early to get seats. And that is when I saw them. Deshawn and Renee were crossing the parking lot toward the side entrance, 50 yards away. He was in navy. She was in white. I noted the choice, understood it immediately. White for innocence, for the blameless family member, for the sympathetic optics of a wife supporting a difficult situation. I don't know at what distance he noticed me, but at some point, between the parking lot and the door, he looked up, and we were looking directly at each other across the space between us. I have thought about what I expected to see in his face in that moment. Defiance, maybe, or shame, or the particular blankness of a man who has decided not to feel anything so that he doesn't have to deal with what he's done. What I saw was something else, something quicker and less controlled than any of those things. For one moment, barely a second, something moved through my son's expression that I recognized because I had put it there. I had raised him, and there are things a mother puts into a child that do not leave no matter what decisions that child makes. He saw me, and he knew I had not come to bend. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I turned my eyes forward and walked toward the courthouse steps. I did not look back. Courtroom Act 1. Morning session, the other side opens at 9:03 a.m. Judge Patricia Sims entered. The room rose. Patricia Sims was 58 years old, a black woman from Decatur who had been on the Fulton County bench for 14 years. She had a reputation for 2 things: absolute impartiality and absolute intolerance for wasted time. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at both tables with the expression of a person who had seen every version of this story and was not interested in theatrics. "We are here in the matter of Douglas versus Douglas, petition for guardianship and contested property transfer," she said. "Mr. Okafor, you may proceed." Trevor Okafor rose from his chair, the way a man rises when he has decided the room already belongs to him. He buttoned his jacket. He walked toward the jury box. 12 people, 8 women, 4 men, ranging from their 30s to their late 60s, and he stood before them with the careful, sorrowful expression of a man about to share difficult news about someone he cared about. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice pitched at exactly the register of concerned reason, "this is not a case about greed. This is not a case about theft. I want you to understand that from the very beginning, because the other side is going to use those words, and I want you to hear what this actually is before they do." He paused. "Let the jury settle. This is a case about a family that loves its matriarch, about a son who watched his mother, a brilliant, accomplished woman who built something truly remarkable from nothing, begin to struggle, quietly, in the way that strong people struggle, privately, invisibly, without asking for help." He went on for 22 minutes. He described me as a woman who had suffered profound grief at the loss of her husband, whose cognitive reserves had been depleted by years of overwork and loss, who had been showing signs of confusion and memory impairment for at least 18 months before the November signing. He used the word decline 7 times. He used the phrase loving concern 4 times. He did not once use my name without preceding it with Mrs. Douglas, which is the courtroom technique of making a person sound like a category rather than an individual. I sat at the plaintiff's table and I listened with my hands flat on the surface in front of me. I did not tighten my jaw. I did not allow my expression to change. I had made a decision weeks earlier, in conversation with Claudette, that I would not perform emotion for this room. Not anger, not hurt, not indignation. Emotion, in a case framed around the question of my stability, was a trap. Every flinch would be noted. Every visible reaction would become evidence for the narrative they were selling. I simply listened. I held still. And I let the jury see a woman who was listening to outrageous things said about her and was not breaking. One juror, seat number 4, a black woman in her early 50s with natural hair and reading glasses she kept taking on and off, was watching me closely. Not watching Okafor, watching me. I could feel the quality of her attention. She was not deciding what to think about the case yet. She was deciding what to think about the woman at the plaintiff's table. She was asking, the way intelligent people ask before they commit, "Is this woman what they say she is?" I let her watch. I had nothing to hide. The first witness Trevor Okafor called was Harold Green, the accountant Deshawn had brought in after taking over the company's operations. 45 years old, a slight man with the defensive posture of someone who knew he was about to say uncomfortable things and had decided to say them anyway. Green testified that during the 4 months he had worked alongside me before the ownership transfer, he had noticed recurring patterns of confusion, repeated questions during financial calls, difficulty retaining information about routine operational decisions, moments of apparent disorientation when discussing documents he considered straightforward. He spoke in measured, professional language. He was careful not to be dramatic about it. The restraint made it more convincing. Claudette cross-examined him without raising her voice. "Mr. Green, do you have any written records of these calls? Notes, follow-up emails, any contemporaneous documentation?" "I don't tend to keep detailed notes of every call." "Do you have dates? Specific dates for any of the incidents you described?" "I couldn't give you exact dates, no." "Could you give me approximate dates, a month, a season?" "It was throughout the fall of 2022. "Throughout the fall. All right." Claudette looked down at her notepad, then back up. "Mr. Green, who hired you?" "Deshaun Douglas." "And who is currently paying your salary?" "Douglas Catering and Events, LLC." "Which is currently owned by?" "Deshaun and Renee Douglas." "Thank you. No further questions." She did not belabor it. She planted the seed and walked away. That is the thing about Claudette Watkins that I had come to understand in the months we worked together. She never used 10 words when 3 would do, and she never asked a question she didn't already know the answer to. The second witness was Dr. Raymond Holt. He was 52, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to being believed. He testified in precise, technical language about cognitive assessment protocols, about the standardized battery of tests he claimed to have administered, about the specific scores that placed me in a range he characterized as early-stage mild cognitive impairment, with particular vulnerability in complex document processing. The language was designed to be impenetrable. It was designed to make the jury feel that disagreeing with him would require a medical degree they did not have. Claudette stood for cross-examination and looked at him for a moment before she spoke. Just a moment, the kind of pause that makes a person wonder what's coming. "Dr. Holt, my first question is simple. Can you describe for the court the room in which you examined Mrs. Douglas? Just general details, the layout, the lighting, the furniture." Holt blinked once, the blink of a man who has been asked something he did not prepare for. "The examination room. We have several rooms in the practice. I see many patients." "Of course. Any detail you can provide, the color of the walls, what Mrs. Douglas was wearing, whether the window in the room faced the street or the back of the building." Silence. Not a thinking silence. A calculating silence. The silence of a man deciding how to construct an answer rather than simply retrieving one from memory. "I'd see a high volume of patients. It would be difficult to— Can you tell me anything about Mrs. Douglas's physical appearance at the examination? Her hair, her height, whether she wore glasses?" Holt looked briefly toward the defense table. It was a small movement, a fraction of a second. But Claudette saw it. I saw it. Juror number 4 saw it. "I cannot recall specific details at this time," Holt said. "You cannot recall because you are a busy professional with many patients," Claudette said evenly. "Or you cannot recall because the examination did not take place?" "Objection." Okafor was on his feet. "Calls for speculation." "Sustained," said Judge Sim. "Move on, Ms. Watkins." Claudette nodded. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." She said at this time with a particular emphasis that Judge Sims noted. I could see it in the slight tilt of her head, and that Okafor heard too, because his jaw shifted in a way that wasn't quite a clench. The courtroom cleared for lunch at 12:15. Claudette moved quickly. She steered me to a small conference room at the end of the hall, the kind courts keep for exactly this purpose, with bad fluorescent lighting and a folding table and 2 plastic chairs. She closed the door and didn't sit down. She set her phone on the table between us and looked at me. This morning was what we expected. Green was credible enough to plant doubt. Holt was shakier than I anticipated, which is good. But the jury is still undecided. I can see it. She paused. "What I'm about to play for you came in this morning at 7 a.m. I've had it verified by 2 independent forensic audio analysts. I cannot tell you the source." She pressed play. The room's bad acoustics made the recording tinny and slightly compressed, but the voices were clear. Unmistakable. Renee's voice. "Raymond signed off. 50,000 into the LLC account. It's clean. It can't be traced back to us." Deshaun's voice lower. "And if she figures it out?" Renee. "She won't. Who's going to believe a confused old woman over a board-certified physician? Claudette stopped the recording. I sat with it for a moment. Dr. Holt received $50,000, Claudette said, transferred from the new LLC into a personal account registered in his name. We have the bank transfer documentation. We have this recording. This afternoon, I am going to put both in front of this courtroom. She looked at me carefully. How are you doing? I thought about the answer honestly before I gave it. I'm angry, I said, but I'm not going to let them see that. Good. I reached into my bag. My hand found the envelope I had placed there that morning, the one I had taken from the nightstand drawer before I left the house. Inside it was a photograph. James and me, standing outside the first Douglas catering location in 1989. James had his arm around my shoulder and was laughing at something off camera. I was looking directly at the lens, chin up, no smile, the look of a woman who has decided that the thing she is building is real. On the back, in James's handwriting, Billy, if I'm not here, you fight. You're stronger than you know. I had found the photograph 3 weeks after he died, tucked into the back of a cookbook he kept on the nightstand, because he liked the photographs in it, even though he never cooked. I did not know he had written on the back. I did not know until the morning I needed to go to a lawyer's office and I had opened the envelope to take the photo with me. I held it through the rest of lunch, and I held it all afternoon. At 2:07 p.m., Claudette stood and said, The plaintiff calls Leroy Patterson. Leroy was 70 years old and moved like it, slowly, deliberately, with the careful economy of a man who had decided some time ago that rushing was for younger people and that the world could wait for him. He wore a navy suit that was at least 10 years old and shoes that had been polished until they held a mirror shine. He sat in the witness chair like a man sitting down to a meal he had waited a long time for. Okafor half rose from his chair. Your Honor, we were not given advance notice. Mr. Patterson is a material witness with direct knowledge of the decedent's stated intentions, Claudette said calmly. He was on the witness list filed February 28th, page 4, second paragraph. Okafor sat back down. He had missed it. That was the second time that afternoon I watched Trevor Okafor discover something in a courtroom that he should have discovered in preparation. Claudette asked Leroy to describe his relationship to James Douglas, and he described it plainly. 41 years of friendship, business partnership in the early days, best man at our wedding, the person James had called whenever he needed to think something through out loud. Then Claudette asked him to describe a specific conversation. Leroy folded his hands in his lap. About 3 months before James died, he called me. He was having a clear day. He had some very clear days right to the end. He said he needed me to hold on to something for him, that he was worried. What was he worried about? He said Deshawn had been asking questions about the property, about how it was held and who would inherit it, and how quickly transfers could happen. He said it didn't sit right with him. James was a quiet man, but he was not a naive man, and he said the questions felt like they were building towards something. What did he give you? Leroy reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a folded document, sealed in a plastic sleeve. Claudette had it authenticated and entered into evidence before Okafor could fully formulate his objection. It is a handwritten codicil, Claudette explained to the court, prepared by James Douglas in October of 2019, witnessed and notarized by a Mr. Cornelius Webb of Decatur, who is prepared to testify if required. The codicil specifically states that the land parcel at 447 Auburn Avenue is to remain in Billy Douglas's sole name for the duration of her natural life, and may not be transferred, encumbered, or reassigned without her written consent obtained in the presence of independent legal counsel. The room shifted. Not loudly, but a shift, the way a building shifts when something settles differently in its foundation. Leroy's testimony was not emotional. He did not cry. He did not editorialize. He stated what he knew in plain language and answered every question with the unhurried directness of a man who had spent his life being taken at his word. It was precisely that absence of performance that made him devastating as a witness. At 2:51 p.m., Claudette called Dr. Raymond Holt back to the stand for redirect examination. He returned to the witness chair with slightly less composure than he had carried in the morning. The posture was the same. The confidence was not. Claudette stood before him without notes. Dr. Holt, I have 2 documents I'd like to enter into evidence. She nodded to her paralegal, who placed them before Judge Sims. The first is a bank transfer record certified by Atlanta Business Banking, dated September 15, 2022. The record shows a wire transfer of $50,000 from the operating account of an LLC registered to Deshawn and Renee Douglas to a personal account registered in your name. The sound in the courtroom was not noise. It was the collective held breath of 60 people trying not to make noise. The second is an audio recording, forensically verified by 2 independent analysts, in which a voice identified as Renee Douglas explicitly references a payment to someone called Raymond in connection with the preparation of an evaluation of Mrs. Billy Douglas. Okafor was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Foundation, chain of custody. The documentation was filed this morning, Mr. Okafor, Claudette said without turning. It's in the supplemental evidence binder on page 37. Judge Sims looked at Okafor over her glasses. Do you have a specific objection to the authenticity of either document, counsel? A pause, brief but visible. I'd like to examine the authentication documentation, Your Honor. You have until tomorrow morning. The documents are conditionally admitted. She looked at Claudette. Continue. Claudette turned back to Holt. Dr. Holt, I'll ask you again to describe anything you can recall about Mrs. Douglas from your examination in September 2022. Her appearance, her demeanor, anything she said to you during the evaluation. Raymond Holt sat very still. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. He looked at a point in the middle distance that contained, I imagined, the entirety of the decision he was now facing. I would like to consult with my attorney before responding further, he said. The room erupted. Not dramatically, not the movie version where everyone stands up and shouts. It was the subtler eruption of professional composure, failing simultaneously across multiple people. 2 jurors leaned toward each other. The court reporter paused and looked up. Okafor pressed 2 fingers flat against the bridge of his nose and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. At the defense table, Renee Douglas uncrossed her legs and placed both feet flat on the floor. That was the moment. That small physical change. The feet flat on the floor. The posture that is no longer above it all, but braced, planted, holding against something, was the moment I knew. Not the moment I won, but the moment they lost. Judge Sims set down her pen. Dr. Holt, this court will recess to allow you to contact legal representation. The court also directs that these materials be referred to the Georgia Composite Medical Board for independent investigation, pending any criminal referral. She looked at him over her glasses with an expression that contained no cruelty and no mercy, just clarity. You are not obligated to say anything further today that may incriminate you. I suggest you choose your next steps carefully. Holt was escorted out. At 3:22 p.m., Claudette rose and said, The plaintiff calls Aaliyah Douglas. The gallery went very quiet. Okafor stood immediately. Your Honor, the proposed witness is the daughter of the defendant. She has clear personal interest and family bias. She also has equal relation to the plaintiff as her grandmother, Claudette said, and she is a 19-year-old adult who has voluntarily come forward. The bias argument applies in both directions, counsel. I'll hear the testimony, Judge Sims said. Objection noted for the record. Proceed. Aaliyah Douglas was 19 years old, and she walked into that courtroom like she was walking the longest hallway of her life. She was wearing a plain blue blouse and dark slacks, and her hair pulled back simply. She did not look toward the defense table. She did not look toward the gallery. She walked the length of the room, and as she passed the plaintiff's table, she slowed for 1/2 step, barely perceptible. And in that fraction of a second, she looked at me. Her eyes were red at the edges. She had been crying before she came in, or she had been fighting not to. I looked at her, and I felt something move in my chest that was larger and more complicated than anything the lawsuit had put there. She was doing the hardest thing a child can do. She sat in the witness chair, and Claudette began. Aaliyah, can you tell the court about a conversation you overheard in October of 2022? Aaliyah straightened. Yes. I was at my parents' house. I was visiting from campus. I was home for fall break. I was in the upstairs hallway, and the door to my dad's home office wasn't closed all the way. I could hear them talking. Who was talking? My dad and Renee. What were they discussing? My grandmother, the property, the signing. She paused. Renee was talking about timing. She said they needed to do it on the right day, that if my grandmother read the documents carefully, she wouldn't sign. So they needed to do it on a day when she was tired, when she trusted him, when she wouldn't look too hard. The words landed in the room with the particular weight of things that cannot be taken back. Did you record this conversation? I started recording on the third day. I knew what I'd heard the first day, but I wasn't sure if I thought maybe I'd misunderstood. So I listened for 3 more days, and on the third day, I started recording. Do you have those recordings? Yes. Claudette had the recordings entered into evidence and played them through the courtroom speakers. The quality was what you'd expect from a cell phone microphone through a door with a half-inch gap, slightly muffled, occasionally unclear. But on the third recording, the longest one, from November 7th, 7 days before the signing, Renee's voice came through with the particular clarity of a person speaking with confidence in a room they believed was private. She's going to sign because she trusts you. That's her weakness. She's a good woman and she trusts her son, and that is exactly what we're going to use. By the time she figures it out, if she ever does, it will be done and documented, and the law will be on our side. Deshawn's voice muffled. And the doctor? Renee. He's handled. Stop asking about it. The recording stopped. The room was absolutely still. I did not look at Deshawn. I was looking at Aaliyah, who was sitting in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes straight ahead. Not at her father, not at Renee, not at me. Straight ahead, into the middle distance, the way a person looks when they are holding themselves together through sheer will. I saw Renee from the corner of my eye. She had set her elbows on the table and placed both hands over her face. Not dramatically, not for effect. The gesture of a person who has run out of angles to calculate. Deshawn sat with his head bowed. The man who had sat in my dark living room 4 years ago and held my hand and told me I was not alone. That man sat at a defense table in a courtroom with his head down while his 19-year-old daughter testified against him. I had no triumph in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because the story would be cleaner if I did. If I could tell you I felt the satisfaction of justice clicking into place. What I felt was older and sadder and more complicated than triumph. I felt the specific grief of a woman who has been right about something she desperately wished she had been wrong about. At 4:17 p.m., Claudette said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff wishes to testify." I stood up from the plaintiff's table. I picked up the envelope with James's photograph. I carried it to the witness stand. I sat down. I adjusted the microphone. I looked at the courtroom, the jury, the gallery, the defense table, the judge, and I breathed. Trevor Okafor came at me first on cross-examination. He had regrouped during the break. His voice had recalibrated to something more measured, the aggression dialed down in favor of a persistent, gently condescending questioning style designed to make me look flustered by attrition. "Mrs. Douglas, you acknowledge that you signed the transfer documents on November 14th, 2022? I signed documents that were represented to me as tax restructuring forms. Yes. And you did not read them carefully before signing. I read the headers and the first paragraph of the first page. My son told me what they were, and I trusted my son. So your position is that you signed documents you didn't read, and now you're holding other people responsible for what was in them?" I looked at him, not with anger, with the patience of a woman who has heard a twisted version of her story and knows exactly where it's twisted. "My position," I said, "is that I signed documents I was deliberately misled about by someone who knew I would not read every page because he had spent 38 years learning exactly how far my trust in him extended. That is not carelessness on my part. That is a targeted exploitation of a mother's love." The room was very still. Okafor shifted tactics. "Mrs. Douglas, isn't it possible that you had been experiencing some genuine cognitive difficulty in the months leading up to November 2022? Grief can affect mental function significantly. Grief affects many things," I said. "It affected my sleep. It affected my appetite. It affected my ability to sit in my living room without expecting to hear my husband's voice. It did not affect my ability to manage a $1.4 million business, to negotiate vendor contracts, to remember every employee's schedule and every client's preferences." I paused. "And it did not affect my ability to notice, on the night I signed those documents, that something felt wrong. That is why I started writing things down the same evening." "Your notebook," Okafor said, a note of dismissal in his voice. "My notebook," I confirmed. "Yes." He tried 2 more approaches and found no purchase in either. Then he took a different road entirely. The low road, I would call it. The one you take when the high road is closed. "Mrs. Douglas, isn't it true that in the months before the transfer, you told multiple employees that you were considering stepping back from active management of the company?" I said I was tired. I said I needed more support. There is a significant difference between saying you need help running something you love and saying you want to give it to someone else. But you did say you were tired. I was 62 years old and I had watched my husband die, and I had been running a business by myself for 3 years. Yes, I was tired. I looked at him directly. Are you suggesting that black women over 60 aren't allowed to be tired without it being used against them in court? A sound moved through the gallery. Not a laugh. Something closer to recognition. Okafor moved on. His final question was quieter. I think he had run out of strategies and was working from instinct. Mrs. Douglas, is it possible in your honest assessment that you may have misunderstood your son's intentions? That what you're characterizing as manipulation might simply have been a son, perhaps misguided, trying to protect his mother? I sat with the question for a moment. Not because I didn't know the answer, because I wanted to give it the weight it deserved. For 6 months, I said, I asked myself that question every single night. Every night I lay in the bed I shared with his father for 30 years, and I asked myself whether I had misread my own child, whether I was the one who had gotten it wrong. I paused. Then I heard his wife's voice on a recording saying, "She's a good woman and she trusts her son, and that is exactly what we're going to use." The room was absolutely silent. After that, I said, I stopped asking. Claudette rose for redirect. She asked me one question. Mrs. Douglas, you mentioned the property on Auburn Avenue. Can you tell the court what that land means to you? Not in financial terms, but in terms of what it represents? I looked down at the envelope in my hands. That land was purchased in 1973 by my mother, Ida Mae Williams Douglas, with money she saved over 15 years of domestic work. She cleaned houses in Buckhead. She ironed other people's shirts and washed other people's dishes and took home $6 an hour, and every week she put money aside. She could not get a mortgage because the banks in Atlanta did not lend to black women in 1973. She paid cash. I looked up at the jury. That land is proof that my family existed, that we worked and saved and built in a city that made it as difficult as it possibly could for us to do so. When my son transferred that land without my knowledge or my consent, he did not take a financial asset from me. I set my hand flat on the witness rail. He tried to erase the evidence of his grandmother's life, and I will not allow that, not while I am standing. I stepped down from the witness stand. I walked back to the plaintiff's table. I did not look at Deshawn. I sat down, placed the envelope with James's photograph in front of me, and I folded my hands on top of it. And I waited for tomorrow. The second day of trial was shorter than the first. Judge Sims reconvened at 9 a.m. Dr. Raymond Holt did not return to the stand. His attorney had filed a statement overnight indicating that his client was exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination regarding all questions related to the financial transaction and the preparation of the cognitive evaluation. The statement was entered into the record. Judge Sims referred the matter formally to the Georgia Composite Medical Board and to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud charges. She did this without editorializing. She stated the facts and the actions and moved forward. That is the thing about Patricia Sims that I had heard about and now understood firsthand. She did not perform justice. She administered it. Okafor made his closing argument in 31 minutes. It was a reduced version of his opening. The same framework, the same language, but the scaffolding had been visibly damaged and he knew it. He leaned heavily on the validity of my signature, on the legal principle that a signed document is a binding document, on the argument that family decisions, however imperfect, were not the business of a civil court. He did not mention Dr. Holt by name. He did not play the recordings back. He asked the jury to focus on what was documented and documented only. He was good at his job. I will say that, honestly. He made the best argument available to him from the material he had, which is all any lawyer can do. Claudette's closing took 19 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She stood before the jury and she said, "You have heard a recording in which Renee Douglas explicitly states that Billy Douglas's love for her son was, and I quote, exactly what we're going to use. I would ask you to hold that sentence in your mind while you deliberate, because that sentence tells you everything you need to know about the nature of this transaction. This was not a family making a difficult decision out of love. This was a deliberate, years-long plan, documented in the defendant's own words, to exploit a mother's trust at the moment of her greatest vulnerability." She paused. Billy Douglas did not come to this courtroom asking for sympathy. She came asking for what every person who has ever built something with their own hands has the right to ask for, that the law recognize what is hers. She turned and looked at me for one moment, not performing for the jury, just looking. And then she turned back. "The evidence will show you what to do. I trust you to do it." She sat down. Judge Sims gave the jury their instructions at 11:14 a.m., and they retired to deliberate. I spent the afternoon in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse with Claudette and Leroy Patterson and Dorothy Freeman, who had driven in that morning and was sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching me the way she had watched me through every difficult thing for 35 years. We did not talk about the case. Leroy told a story about James from 1987 that I had not heard before. Something about a delivery truck and a wrong address and a wedding cake that arrived at the wrong house. It made me laugh for the first time in what felt like months. The laugh surprised me with how real it felt, how unguarded. Dot reached across the table and squeezed my hand and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. At 4:47 p.m., Claudette's phone buzzed. She looked at it. She looked at me. "They're back," she said. The courtroom filled back up in 12 minutes. People materialized from the hallway, the lobby, the coffee shop around the corner. The gallery refilled with the same faces that had been there the day before, tight around the eyes, still, waiting. Deshawn and Renee were already at the defense table when I arrived. Deshawn's tie was loosened, which it had not been at any point during the previous day and a half. He was looking at the surface of the table in front of him. Renee sat with her hands in her lap and her chin no longer tilted upward. I sat down. I placed the envelope with James's photograph in front of me the way I had placed it every time I sat at that table. Judge Sims entered. We rose. We sat. The foreperson of the jury, a man in his late 40s, a building contractor from Smyrna who had taken careful notes throughout both days, stood and delivered the verdict with the careful enunciation of someone who understood the weight of what they were reading. On the matter of the petition for legal guardianship, the jury finds that the petitioner has failed to establish by the required standard of evidence that the respondent, Billy Douglas, lacks the capacity to manage her own personal and financial affairs. The petition is denied. I felt the first thing leave my chest. It was a weight I had been carrying for 11 months, and I had grown so accustomed to it that its absence felt for a moment like a physical sensation, like setting down something heavy that you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. The foreperson continued. On the matter of the contested property transfer of November 14, 2022, the jury finds that the transfer documents were obtained through material misrepresentation and intentional fraud, and that the signatures of Billy Douglas were secured under conditions that did not constitute informed consent. The transfers are hereby declared void and unenforceable. The room exhaled. On the matter of damages, the jury awards the plaintiff actual damages of $340,000, representing lost revenue, legal costs, and documented financial harm resulting from the fraudulent transfer. The jury additionally awards punitive damages of $200,000, reflecting the deliberate and premeditated nature of the defendant's conduct. I looked at the table in front of me. I did not cry. I did not make a sound. I sat very still, and I let the words settle over me the way you let rain settle over dry ground, not rushing it, not deflecting it, just letting it come. Claudette placed her hand on my arm. That was all. Renee Douglas pushed her chair back from the table and stood up before Okafor could reach her. She did not look at the jury, did not look at the judge, did not look at me. She walked toward the side exit with her heels on the marble and the sound of it. That same deliberate click that Trevor Okafor's footsteps had made the morning before now carried something entirely different. Deshawn remained seated. He sat at the defense table after the room began to clear, after Okafor laid a hand briefly on his shoulder and then picked up his briefcase and left, after the gallery began filtering out in the particular murmur of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for a long time. He sat there for a while. I do not know what he was thinking. I did not stay to find out. I did not go straight to the car. After the room cleared, after Claudette had gathered her documents and Leroy had shaken my hand with both of his, and Dot had stood in the hallway outside the courtroom and held me for a long moment without speaking, I told them I needed 5 minutes. I walked back into the empty courtroom alone. The fluorescent lights were still on. The gallery was empty. The tables were cleared. Without the bodies and the breath and the weight of what had just happened inside it, The room was just a room. Old wood and cold air and the particular silence of a public building after hours. I walked to the plaintiff's table. I placed my hand flat on the surface. James Douglas had never set foot in this building. He had died before any of this was set in motion. But I felt him in that room the way I had felt him in the coffee shop that afternoon when Leroy made me laugh. Not as a presence exactly, but as a quality of the air, something that had been transmitted forward through time by the simple fact of who he was. I took the photograph out of the envelope. I looked at him for a long time. Then I turned it over and read his handwriting one more time. Billy, if I'm not here, you fight. You're stronger than you know. I put the photograph back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my bag. I walked out of the courtroom and down the marble hallway and through the glass doors into the late afternoon air of Atlanta. Aaliyah was standing outside. She was alone, leaning against the stone railing at the top of the courthouse steps, still in her blue blouse, her arms crossed against the cold. She had not gone back to the dormitory. She had waited. She saw me come through the doors and she straightened up. Her arms dropped to her sides. She looked at me with the expression of a young person who has done something enormous and is not yet sure how the world will receive it. I walked toward her. I stopped in front of her. She said very quietly, "Grandma, I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I looked at my granddaughter, 19 years old, standing on courthouse steps having just testified against her father because she had decided that the truth mattered more than the comfort of silence. I put my arms around her. She was taller than me by 2 inches, and when she leaned into the embrace, she bent her head the way tall people do, and I held her the way I had held her when she was small enough to sit on the kitchen counter and watch me cook, completely, without reservation. "You said it when it counted," I told her. "That's enough. That's always enough." She held on for a long moment. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She had her grandfather's jaw and her father's eyes, and something entirely her own in the set of her mouth. A quality I recognized not because I had given it to her, but because I had watched it develop in her over 19 years. Steadiness, the kind that comes from inside, not from performance. "What do I do now?" she asked. "About my dad. You don't have to figure that out today," I said. "Today you just go back to school and do your work, and let yourself be 19 years old for a little while." She nodded. "Come to dinner Sunday," I said. "I'll make cornbread." She smiled. It was a small smile, incomplete. There was too much in the way for it to be full, but it was real. "I'll be there," she said. Claudette found me in the parking lot 5 minutes later. She got in the driver's seat without being asked. She had been driving me since February, and she had the particular ease of someone who knows they are needed. We sat in the car for a moment before she started the engine. "There will be follow-up," she said. "The DA's office will likely reach out regarding Holt. Deshawn and Renee may face criminal charges on the fraud. We'll know more in the next few weeks." "I know," I said. "And the transfer reversal takes 30 to 60 days to process through the county." "Claudette." She stopped. I looked at her. "Can we just drive for a minute before we talk about what comes next?" She looked at me. Then she put the car in drive. We drove through Atlanta in the late afternoon, through the part of the city that was old and the part that was new, and the stretch along Auburn Avenue where Douglas Catering and Events had been a green awning and a painted name on a brick wall for 16 years. I looked at the building as we passed it. The awning was still green. The name had been changed on the signage. Douglas Family Catering, it said now, Renee's rebranding. But the building itself was the same building, brick by brick. It was mine again. I looked at it, and I said nothing, and I let the car carry me forward. I want to tell you something that doesn't fit into the dramatic version of this story, because it is the thing that matters most. While the lawsuit was pending, while Claudette was building the case and the court date was still months away, I had a Saturday morning with nothing to do for the first time in 30 years. I had no commercial kitchen. I had no events to prepare for. I had an early morning quiet in my house that felt on the bad days like emptiness, and on the better days like space. I made cornbread, not for an event, not for a client. I made it in Ida May's cast iron pot, the 12-quart black one on the shelf, the one with the wire-repaired handle. I made it the way she taught me, coarse ground yellow cornmeal, buttermilk, a particular ratio of baking powder that she had adjusted by feel over 40 years until it was exactly right. I put it in a basket lined with a dish towel, and I drove to Greater Shiloh Baptist, and I walked into the fellowship hall at 7:30 in the morning, and I set it on the table, and I said to whoever was there, "Help yourself." There were 6 people that first Saturday. The second Saturday, there were 14. By the 6th Saturday, word had reached the neighborhood the way word always reaches a neighborhood that takes care of its own, through mouths, through phone calls, through somebody's cousin telling somebody's neighbor. There were 43 people in the fellowship hall, and I had brought 3 baskets, and they were gone in 20 minutes, and people were still coming in. A woman named Loretta, 68 years old, recently widowed, who had been a customer of Douglas Catering for 11 years, sat down next to me while I was eating my own piece, and she said, "Billy, I have been eating your cornbread for 11 years, and I did not know it tasted like this when you made it yourself." I said, "It's the same recipe." She shook her head. "No, it is not the same." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think what she tasted was the difference between something made for commerce and something made for love. The recipe was identical. The hands were the same. But the reason was different. And somehow, that traveled through the cast iron and the buttermilk and the heat and arrived in the result. Ida May always said that. I was 63 years old before I fully understood it. By the spring following the trial, Aaliyah Douglas had completed her first semester at Georgia State with a 3.8 GPA. She came to dinner every Sunday without exception. She was learning to make the cornbread, slowly, with her hands in the batter and her elbows on the kitchen counter and her long grandmother's legs, she had Ida May's height, folded against the cabinet. She asked questions the way serious students ask questions, not to fill silence, but because she genuinely wanted to know. I answered every one. The Saturday morning breakfasts at Greater Shiloh had grown into something that didn't have a name yet. It was not a business. It was not a charity. It was just a table and a cast iron pot and an open door, and on any given Saturday morning there were between 60 and 90 people who came and sat and ate and talked, and more than a few of them were women over 60 who had their own versions of a story that rhymed with mine. Women who had built things and nearly lost them. Women who were in the middle of fighting to keep them. Women who needed to sit across a table from someone who had come out the other side. I did not offer advice unless it was asked for. I offered cornbread. I offered the table. I offered the particular thing that I have learned, at 63 years old, is the most valuable thing one person can offer another. Evidence that it is possible to survive. People ask me sometimes whether I regret any of it. Whether, knowing what I know now, I would have done something differently. Signed differently. Trusted differently. Built the walls higher and kept more people outside them. I understand why they ask. It is a human question, the desire to identify the error so that the error can be avoided next time. We are all, in some way, trying to reverse engineer the fall. But I have sat with that question long enough to know my answer, and my answer is no. I trusted my son completely because that is what a mother does with a child she has watched grow from nothing into a person. I built my business on relationships and reputation and loyalty, because that is the only way to build something that lasts. I signed the papers because I believed the man across the table from me loved me. The error was not mine. The error belonged entirely to the people who looked at my love and saw a vulnerability instead of a gift. What I would tell any woman in the middle of what I went through, whether it is a son, a husband, a business partner, a family member who has decided that your success belongs to them, is this. The people who exploit your trust are counting on your grief to make you smaller than you are. They are counting on the love you have given them to make you doubt your own memory, your own clarity, your own right to be angry. They are counting on 60 years of being told that a good woman absorbs pain quietly to keep you from picking up the phone and calling a lawyer. Do not absorb it quietly. Write things down. Keep records. Trust the small voice that said something is wrong on the night you cannot name why. Call the lawyer. Walk into the courtroom. Sit at the table with your back straight and your hands flat and let them say what they will say, and then let the truth speak for itself. I am 63 years old. I am a black woman from Atlanta, Georgia. I have built 2 businesses, raised a child, loved a husband for 30 years, and lost more than I thought I could survive. I have sat in a courtroom and listened to my own son argue that I was not capable of managing my own life. I am still standing. And every Saturday morning, I stand at a stove in a church fellowship hall on Auburn Avenue, the avenue my mother walked in 1971 with $47 and a cast iron pot and the belief that you could build a life if you knew how to cook, and I make cornbread for anyone who walks through the door. The recipe is Ida May's. The hands are mine. The door is open. They said I was confused. The judge disagreed. And the cornbread never tasted better.